Hi, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Financial Transformation Live. This is an episode with a difference. You'll have to excuse me, but I'm actually recording this from Greece. If you've noticed a different setup and wondering why the change, I'm literally going global with CFO 4.0 and Financial Transformation Live. But today's session is going to be all about the process improvement maturity scale. So what this is all about is actually understanding where you and your team are at in terms of your development with process engineering and process documentation, etc. So I want to talk you through how you can assess your own maturity, and then talk about how you can look at your processes as a whole and figure out where you want to go. So let's get started. So today's session, for those of you who haven't listened to an episode of CFO 4.0 or been on one of my live sessions before, my name's Hannah Munro. I'm Manager, Director and Transformation Lead here at ITAS. So we're a financial transformation consultancy that specialises in Sage technologies. We've won a number of awards within both the Sage and outside of Sage ecospace, but we're all about helping people get the most out of their Sage technologies and using that to drive that change in finance. And the reason I started these sessions is that a lot of the skills that we talk to our customers about aren't just applicable to Sage, right? They are applicable across the board. So I want to talk you through what we've got. Okay, so for those of you that didn't make or have a chance to listen to last month's session, which is all about how do you future-proof your finance team? What are some of the things you need to be thinking about? And what does each of the ledgers look like now, or used to now, and how will they look in the future? Just to kind of get your brain thinking about how AI is going to change finance, but also what we can do now to be getting ready for that shift and that change. Okay, so that is now available on demand, so you guys can grab it whenever you're ready. So let's talk about how do we assess process maturity, okay? And what I'm really talking about here is not an individual process's maturity, but as a team, as an organization, how mature are we in our process development? Because there are some major benefits to having a mature organization when it comes to process, because it reduces risk, because you don't have to, because you're embedding controls and auditability into those processes, but it also drives productivity. And I think when you look at some of the stats around how productive, particularly in the UK, we are, this is a real area of focus, I think, for a lot of people, and it should be, because as the technology is changing, we need to make sure that we are geared up to take advantage of it. And a lot of this is like what I call like the base layer that you need in order to drive true transformation and actually get yourselves to a point where your processes are adding value, they're not slowing things down. So there are a number of different areas within this that you need to look at. So the first is like how well do people within your team, within your organization know their processes, and that's what we call process knowledge. That's what we call process knowledge. Then we've got measurement. So how are we tracking the performance of a process, and how do we do that? Who owns the process? So ownership. So who owns the process, and what does that look like in an immature organizational team and then in a mature one? How are we using technology as part of our processes, and what does an immature versus a mature organization look like in terms of how they utilize technology? Talking about how you optimize, because anybody that has worked in an organization that has a true maturity with their processes will know that processes don't stay still; they constantly evolve. So what does that look like again at an early development perspective versus a more mature organization? And how are we documenting? What sort of things should we be considering as part of that process? And just talking about effectiveness. So how effective is a process? And again, how does that look in a newer, maybe less mature organization versus a more mature organization? Okay. So those are the sort of key areas we're going to talk through, and I'm going to talk to you about those processes. And I put companies into maybe 5 categories, and I've given them names. So I've got the initial stage, so when you're just sort of starting on your process development journey. Inconsistent. And I think this is really important because very often people can know what they need to do, but they haven't consistently applied it. So that's kind of that sort of, okay, we're past the journey, we're starting on a journey, but we're not quite there with all of our processes. Deployed is once the processes are in place, and how does that look? Measured is once we're at a point where we're actually starting to analyze the processes and how they're working. And optimize is what we should all really be aiming for. And what does that really mature organization look like in terms of its process maturity? Okay, so the first area that we're going to look at is process knowledge. So in an early stage organization, and I'm not talking about, you've only been around, I'm talking very much in terms of their process knowledge. So an early stage, in an early sort of less process mature organization, the processes tend to sit in people's heads, right? And the one way to tell if you're this organization is that when somebody new joins your finance team, do you give them the book and the process list for them to just look over and work through? Or does somebody have to sit them down and take them through the process? And there is actually a stage before, and I've seen this before, where there isn't a person that knows the process. So there's almost like a precursor to that. But if you are that organization where all of the processes, the questions that you need to ask around a transaction are sitting in somebody's head, you are sitting in that initial stage. The next piece is where the processes are known. So, there's more than one person that knows a process and how it works, but perhaps there's slight differences in how you each apply that same process. Maybe you don't use the same fields, perhaps for the right information. Maybe you approach it slightly different ways, etc. So that's what we call inconsistent. So where you might have two people in a team, but they're both deploying the process slightly differently with maybe different checks and balances. In the deployed piece, so we're moving down our maturity model, but everybody knows the process and everybody follows those processes consistently, right? And that's where I like to think most people should be at as a bare minimum, and that's what we certainly work towards. But it is really interesting as we go into organizations, particularly at their early stages of their transformation, like where they are. And then measured. So for me, as you're starting to develop the maturity, it's not just you that knows the process, it's the wider organization. So your other teams know how their inputs feed into your core processes. And then those processes and knowledge of those processes is shared amongst the wider organization. And the most mature organizations are proactively sharing knowledge across the organization, and you don't just know your processes, you know other people's, and there's a shared knowledge and a shared expectation that other people should know. So as you can see, process knowledge can develop, and the most mature organizations, which we should be aiming for, there is an understanding of not just like what are the steps you're going to follow, but what are the controls in place, what are the triggers and validations that need to happen through that process. Okay. So next thing is measurement. So with measurement, what we're, at the early stages, you've not even got the process documented, right? So in that initial stage, there is unlikely to be any measurement in place. And the same with the inconsistent phase is because at that stage, you're not consistently applying a process, so you can't measure it. So those stages, we don't tend to have any measurement. Once we get to deployed, it might be you have a task-based KPI. So maybe you're thinking, how long does it take me to just enter this transaction, for instance? So that would be a task-orientated KPI. But once we get into the measured and that sort of more mature organization, we will understand sort of the KPIs that sit at each stage of the process, and not just in terms of time, but what's the error rate that we're working to? What's the time for a transaction to flow straight through from start to finish, and what does that look like? And just the fact that you're starting to measure at that level is what we would call measured. So once you're actually getting those statistics out and that data out, and then the optimizers, you're not just focused on the measurement, you're focused on the optimization. So on top of that, you've also got measurement around how much you've improved those metrics as well. So Again, measurement's a really key thing, but it is quite an advanced part of the maturity model, so it doesn't tend to apply in the early stages. The first stage with any process piece is actually getting it documented, and we'll talk about that a bit later. Ownership. So I think this is something that isn't necessarily talked about enough with process, is that who owns that process, who is accountable for it, and who is responsible for it, etc. So in the initial stages, the reality is nobody really owns a process normally. Somebody might do a process, but they're not responsible for making sure it's effectively delivered by others. In inconsistent organizations, we tend to find that there's ad hoc responsibility. So like somebody will take part of a process and they'll just take ownership for that bit. But not every process has an owner. Nobody really and there tends to be like an inconsistent ask around. So the one way you could figure out when you do this is that if somebody said, right, how do I enter a purchase invoice? Who would be the person that would be the person to take them through that process? And is that person the person that's also running that process and documenting it, etc.? So I guess that's one way you could ask yourself whether you're there. So with deployed, there are designated process owners. So if you want to understand a process, you want to make an improvement to a process, you know who to go to. And then once we start getting to, again, the more mature organizations, is that there's multiple levels of ownership. So you'll have both obviously an internal individual process owner. You'll have somebody at C-level that's owning that overarching process, and even cross team. You'll have more discussion about shared ownership of processes. And optimized is that you're actually aligning each of your processes with the organizational goals. So if you think about your organization's values and goals, so things like, we want to create an amazing customer experience, well, analyzing your credit control process to understand how it delivers that. If you're part of your requirement is to be incredibly responsive, that's one of the values that you as an organization look to do, then how are you measuring and making sure that your process aligns with those values? So that's once we're getting into real ownership, in that there's a shared ownership of not just the actual process, but actually aligning that process with the values of the organization. And technology. So thinking about how you're using technology within your processes. So again, if for those that are at that early stages, they're probably very paper based, because that tends to be where everybody starts. Is you're starting to use paper to actually drive a process. So and there is a precursor to this stage, is that if you think about the typical PO process, you may not even have a PO process. And so the first start is like, can we just get something down on paper? Can we get people requesting, sending an email to request to spend? And that might just be your first point of call. And then you get to the inconsistent. So inconsistent, for instance, would be some people using paper, some people using emails, some people using the ERP system to drive, to generate a PO. And that's when we've got sort of ad hoc, maybe non-integrated systems. So the systems don't necessarily talk to each other. And then the deployed. So in the ideal world, on the deployed, then we're actually got the process itself is fully digitized. So rather than having a paper-based purchase order in this instance, we would have a digital purchase order, and and all of the systems are integrated. So some people might enter a purchase order directly into the finance system. Some people might use the procurement software that you guys you've deployed for your sort of wider organizational users, but everything integrates and works well together. And that process is fully digitized with digital approvals. So we're not chasing things up via email. Everything is automated, and there's a digital trail around that. And as we continue to go, you might ask, well, what's next? Well, no, what's next is, what about proactive automations and alerts? So proactive validations, things like budget alerts. So, before you even get to sending a purchase order to that person who's over budget, when it's over budget, is that how can end users start to get notifications of when those things are happening, and be more proactive at earlier stages to minimize the amount of checks and balances you need. It could be that there's an alert, so things like validations around, If a purchase order doesn't, purchase invoice doesn't match a purchase order, how does it automatically deal with that? And using things like automations and AI to drive that technology. And then optimized is when you actually have a genuine system strategy that aligns with your processes. So, technology strategy and enables your organization to really automate its processes. And this is where, things like business process automation, BPA style systems come in, which help you sort of connect the dots, but also do that more proactive triggers and alerts. You can do some of that a lot of time within systems, but having, rather than sort of pulling a report to find an issue or manually checking something, how can you use technology to drive that forwards? And that's when we're starting to see a much more mature organization. And then how do you approach optimization of processes within this maturity model? So obviously there's in the initial stages, you've not really established a process. You can't improve what you don't understand or know. So that's the first thing. So your initial stages, when there's no optimization going on, we're just trying to get through the day job. With an inconsistent organization, what there tends to be is a list of things that people know are a problem, but nobody's actually necessarily driving change and implementing those processes. Or if they are, it's very ad hoc and it's not done as part of a wider sort of strategy. So, and that's what, again, we see at the early stages. People start to develop their process knowledge and their understanding of how to build good processes and to drive good productivity. And then we get to the deployed. So, you're starting to know you're on the right track is when you've got changes, but they're ad hocly implemented. I'm not sure if the ad hocly is a word, but we're going to go with it. But basically what I mean by that is that there's not a rigorous program and a regular schedule on how you review and how you deploy changes. It's very much seen this, okay, have we got time to do that? Yes, okay, let's go do it. So you're very much in that sort of ad hoc reactive approach to process change and optimization versus a more sort of proactive approach to change and improvement. And that's when we're starting to get into the maturity around optimizations, when we hit measured. So in measured, I would expect an organization at that stage to be having some kind of schedule on how often they review their processes, and then effectively project managing the implementation of those changes, right? So there would be at least a regular review point and a program and a project management process that sits around implementing those changes. So, they're actually starting to see some change management coming through. Optimized, like the ultimate stage of maturity, is you're not waiting for a regular review point. You're continuously developing your processes. So as something changes, or as an issue is identified, or a way of improvement is identified, that goes through validation process to understand if it's going to drive change and if it aligns with the values of the organization and it delivers what it needs to. But then then there's change management that sits and deploys it, and then all the documentation, etc. So it falls through, and you just get this lovely circle of change that continues to happen with your processes. And that's when your organization's at an optimized state, is when you're not having to wait for a review point to drive change. And you're not having to look at a process, you're not having to schedule in to look at a process, because it's just process change is embedded in your organization and is part of how you work. Documentation. So I probably should have started with this, and I'll make a note of that when I publish this model. But documentation is obviously a key part, and you can't change anything unless you have it documented. Is my genuine belief, right? I know certainly when I go to implement new systems, those organizations that have processes are always a step ahead, generally, in terms of they are much more ready to go, because they've actually thought through the process. They don't have to like their process. It doesn't have to be a good process, but they understand what the current processes are. And even within that, I will see different levels, and that's what I'm going to talk you through. So the first thing is, at an initial stage, it's unlikely I'll go into an organization that won't have any documentation, and that's very much they're very much in the immature stage of process maturity. Then inconsistent. So they'll have some processes document, normally something that the auditors have requested, if I'm being really honest, or somebody's asked for, or it's part of their risk audit that's been required. But not all of their processes are documented. And very often there are gaps in the quality of that process as well. So, and as we move up the scale, so in that sort of what I'm calling the deployed, so is that the processes are there, but perhaps there's not any supporting documentation like procedures, or there's not controls documentation to support it either. So it's not very thorough, but at least it's there and it's a starting point. And then once we're starting to get into that more mature organization, is that there'll actually be a given way on how you document processes. So everybody uses the same tool, or almost like a shared way of doing those processes. And those are, those are in there. And then once you get to the optimization, there's normally a shared library. There's some place you go across the wider organization where everybody goes. Every department is expected to have their processes documented in the same way using the templates that they're given. And there's also a regular review and continuous review process around that documentation. Because again, if you're in an organization that is getting into that sort of continuous improvement methodology, it has to roll through to the documentation. So that's what you're seeing in that more optimized organization. It's much more proactive, but also much more thoroughly documented. So you'll have a much deeper level of detail and a much more consistent level of detail across all of your processes. And then we get into effectiveness. And again, this is probably where most people start, but for me, the effectiveness tends to be a result of all of the other things. So the initial stage, there will be very manual processes. There's probably a huge amount of wasted time. There's a lot of wasted effort, and you'll often see a lot of frustration with organizations, within organizations, both in team but also cross team. So there'll be, the sorts of things you might hear is, oh, it takes forever to do this, or why is this happening? What do I do with this one? When you start to have these conversations, you know that they are manual and ineffective processes. As we start to get it better, there'll be ad hoc optimizations. So, there'll be certain processes that work well and perhaps others that aren't working particularly well. And then, when we get into the deployed piece, there tends to be an end-to-end lean process. So, where everybody's aware, it's not, in most instances, it's not overly effective. And sometimes in those organizations, you'll see the balance between control and productivity isn't there. So a process will either be overly controlled, so it takes a lot longer, or it will be very efficient, but perhaps won't have the controls and checks and balances that an organization needs. So again, that's it's one of those hard things to sort of get a gauge on, but that's again what I typically see in less mature organizations, that they haven't quite got the balance between productivity and control right. And then as we go through, is that actually processes deliver on the goals. So when you're starting to align with the goals of the organization, they're seen as delivering on the overarching goals of an organization. And then in the optimized state, they're actually seen as a strategic advantage. They're actually deriving a value add for the organization, for the employees, or for the customers. And when you start to hear that, you're in the right space. So again, at the early stage, it's likely to be your processes are a barrier. So you'll hear a lot of whinging about them and why they're an issue and a challenge in a more or a less mature organization. Once you get into the optimized pieces, everyone just follows the process. You won't hear huge amount of pushback. You won't get a lot of pushback on people following processes. You're less likely to see people going around a process as well once you're in that optimized state. So those are the sorts of things you can look out for to understand sort of where you're at in your organization. Okay, so let's just summarize that then. So that initial stage, what you've got is very much a lack of consistency, a lack of documentation, and very manual processes. The midpoint, the deployed, is that you tend to have known processes that are done in the same way, consistently, that are there's a level of ownership. that processes tend to be more digitized, even if they're not overly efficient, but they tend to be in a digital form. And you tend to have an understanding that you need to change and tweak those processes, but maybe not formal infrastructure and a process by how you actually go through optimization. And the processes generally tend to be documented at that stage. Like we're normally working with organizations that have an internal process tool or a way of documenting, even if it's not a shared library of processes. Everyone's doing the documentation, then we just may not be doing it consistently. And if we flip right to the other end, what we have there is processes that proactively manage, that are consistently being an ongoing review, that's feeding into measuring and reporting and assessing the effectiveness of those processes on a continuous basis, that those processes are aligned with the organization's goals, that they are really driving strategic advantage and actually are allowing you to step ahead and leapfrog. And, as you scale, again, one question you can ask yourself to kind of establish this is, well, if we doubled in size, would we need to double our team? And that's a really good way to understand process effectiveness. And then there's a shared understanding of process, but there's a shared documentation and a shared way of documenting processes across the organization. And that's when you're in that optimized state. So I hope this assessment, I'd be really interested to hear your feedback about where you, as you're listening to this, as you're watching this, where you think you sit as an organization. And then do you think there's any different and I don't think that an organization necessarily is for each of the categories you might be in one or two. So when you're assessing this, look at those different areas. So process knowledge, measurement, ownership, technology, optimization, documentation, and effectiveness. And actually assess yourself, because you might find that actually, like majority of your areas are in the sort of the middle stage, the level 3 deployed, but maybe there's just a bit around documentation and review that's holding you back from being more mature. And actually that then gives you a way of you focusing on what is it that we need to change as a team, as an organization, to actually drive process maturity and actually get to that more optimized stage. So team, I hope this has been useful and I hope it's given you some food for thought. And that's what these sessions are all about. Just thinking about and giving you as individuals, as leaders within your organizations, things to consider and think about. And also to maybe challenge because again, it could be easy to say, oh, we've got all of our process documented. We're really well on track. Well, there's more to it than just documentation. So that's hopefully some food for thought for everybody. The next session I'm going to be running is all about designing effective reporting and data structures. So I've done something similar on this before, but I've had a lot of conversations recently where people aren't necessarily thinking through how they're using their data structures. And certainly from some of the conversations that I've been having and some research being, and I do think that data and its optimization needs to start now, so that when all these great tools like AI come through, it's going to be those that have their data and their data structures in the right design that are going to be able to take the most advantage. So we're going to have a look at that and just kind of do some refreshing on what does a good data structure look like? What do we need to think about when we're designing effective data structures? And that's the next session that's coming up next month. And for those of you that are sort of really your process heading, like, right, how do I move this forward? So there's a couple of things. As always, if you are evaluating your technology stack, then please do check out our Sage product quiz. We've got a quiz you can run to figure out which Sage product is right for you, sort of a way to do it without speaking to one of our team. But of course, you can always reach out if you need to. We've got, I've got a session on how you can automate and streamline with Sage Intacct. And for those that are really in that process piece, I've put in a link here to one of the first process sessions I actually did on Financial Transformation Live, which is how to document your processes. And it's just kind of an intro for those that are starting. Maybe you're at that initial stage and you're just looking to start your documentation journey. So that would be probably one I would look at as a starting point. For those that are perhaps more mature and you're already starting to document, but now you're into kind of the review and optimization piece, then I've got that session as well that's available. I haven't put it in this link, but I will make sure it's added into the show notes for those of you that want the more advanced side of things. So if you found this session useful, I would really love to hear your feedback, and also to understand, what areas of that process matrix do you need most help with? If there, perhaps you want more focus on how you standardize your documentation, what sort of things you should be looking at. Perhaps you want some help with how do you use technology more effectively. I am not sure, so I don't want to put any questions in people's heads, but I would really love some inspiration for my next couple of sessions, because I'm just putting my schedule together for the next few months. So would love to hear from you. Please do give me your questions, queries, and areas you'd really love me to spend more time on, and maybe something that's more relevant to you right now. Then please do reach out. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can email me, hannah.munro@itassolutions.co.uk. Would love to hear from you. Please do give me your thoughts on topics, questions, because basically it inspires me to do the next session. So I'd love some inspiration from you guys. And if you've enjoyed the session, of course, please do let us know by leaving a review, because that really does help us drive more listeners and drive more awareness of the power of finance transformation within organizations. So thank you so much for joining me. I hope you've enjoyed this, and speak soon next time on Financial Transformation Live.